The morning, Sylvia Voss. No. The morning. Let me write this directly. The night before her wedding, Lenora Cavendish sat at the edge of her bed and listened to the house settle around her. She was 23 years old, and she had never once chosen anything for herself. Not the school she attended, not the friends her mother approved of, not the man she would marry in the morning. Her father had arranged that last part in the final months of his illness, and she had not argued because arguing with a dying man felt like a particular kind of cruelty she was not willing to practice. His name was Graham Whitmore. He was 31, the son of a man who had once saved her father's shipping company from ruin, and their marriage was, as her father had described it with the satisfaction of someone balancing a ledger, a natural conclusion to a long friendship. Lenora had met Graham exactly 4 times before the engagement was announced. She had found him, each time, impeccably dressed and completely unreachable. He spoke in precise, measured sentences. He did not laugh at things that were not genuinely funny. He held his opinions the way some men held their cards, close, with no expression to betray them. He was not unkind. He was also not warm, and when her father had looked up from his sickbed and asked if she had any objections, she had looked at this man who was a stranger to her, and she had said, "No, father, none." That was the year 1887, and Lenora had been lying to people she loved for as long as she could remember. The house Graham brought her to was called Whitmore Hall, which had always struck her as the kind of name a man invented for a place he wanted to seem more significant than it was. It sat 4 miles outside of Harrowfield, a market town in the north of England that received less sun than it deserved, with grounds that were impressive in the way of things that required constant maintenance to remain so. There were 12 rooms she was told to use freely, and 6 she understood immediately she was not to enter without reason. Graham's mother, Mrs. Evelyn Whitmore, received her in the front parlor on the afternoon of her arrival, and offered her tea and a thin surgical smile. "We are very practical people here," Mrs. Whitmore said. "You will find that directness is valued." Lenora thanked her and drank the tea and understood that this was not an introduction. It was a declaration of terms. She spent the first weeks learning the rhythms of the house. Graham rose at 6:30 and breakfasted alone. He rode out at 8 and did not return until midday. He worked in his study from 1 o'clock until dinner, and at dinner he spoke of the estate, the tenants, the weather, and occasionally politics, and never of her, or himself, or the space between them that seemed to grow larger the more carefully they both tried to pretend it was not there. She managed the household. She met with Mrs. Pruitt, the housekeeper, every Monday morning. She reviewed the accounts, which were in better order than she had expected, and made small improvements to the kitchen garden that no one commented on, but that she noticed being used. She wrote letters to her mother in London. She read in the evenings by the fire while Graham read across the room, and they did not speak, and she told herself that this was simply what marriage was when it was built on practicality rather than feeling. She told herself many things in those first months. She told herself she did not mind when Graham accepted an invitation to dine at Lord Ashfield's, without mentioning it to her until the morning of, because she had not yet been introduced to Lord Ashfield, and it would have been awkward. She told herself she did not mind when she heard him tell his old university friend, Prentice, that he had married a sensible girl, not much fuss. She told herself she did not mind the cold way he looked at her across the breakfast table, not with dislike, but with the particular blankness of a man who had simply never learned to look at a woman, as though she were a person who had an interior life worth regarding. She was quite good at telling herself things. The letter came 18 months into the marriage, tucked into a volume of her father's papers, that his solicitor had finally sent on. She had not known such a letter existed. She sat down at the small writing desk in her sitting room, and opened it with hands that were steadier than she felt. "My dear Lenora," her father had written, and his handwriting was the shaky, determined script of a man who knew he was writing something he would not be alive to explain. "I am not a man who speaks easily of feeling. You know this. You have always known this about me, and I believe it is a thing I owe you an apology for, and so I am writing this down instead, because I find it easier to be honest when I am not being watched. I arranged your marriage to Graham Whitmore because he is a good man, and because I believe he is capable of becoming a better one. He is not like his father, who was warm and careless with his warmth. Graham is like me, in ways that I do not always think well of. He holds things in. He doesn't know what to do with softness. But, Lenora, and I say this knowing you will receive this only after we are both settled into whatever arrangements life has made for us. He noticed you, the first time we brought you to the Whitmore house, when you were 17 and you got down on your knees in the grass because you'd seen a hawk come down in the far field, and you wanted a better look. I saw him watching you. He didn't know I saw. He looked at you the way a man looks at something that surprises him. Like he hadn't expected anything to be that interesting. I don't know if that will be enough. I don't know if noticing is enough. But I know you, and I know that you are capable of more patience than I have ever deserved from you, and I am asking you to extend some of that patience to a man who doesn't yet know how to deserve it either. Your father. She read the letter twice. Then she folded it very precisely along its original creases, and placed it in the small wooden box where she kept her most important papers, and she sat for a long time looking out the window at the gray Harrowfield sky. He noticed her, 17 years old, kneeling in the grass to see a hawk. She did not know what to do with that. What she did, in the end, was nothing. Or rather, she did what she had always done. She managed. She ran the house with quiet efficiency. She learned which tenants needed assistance before they asked for it, and arranged for that assistance to appear as naturally as possible, so no one felt the particular humiliation of charity. She befriended the vicar's wife, Mrs. Alderton. Not her, wait. The vicar's wife. She sat on the committee for the village school. She learned the name of every child on the Whitmore estate under the age of 12. Graham noticed none of this. Or if he did, he gave no indication. What he did do, in the second year of their marriage, was begin to speak of her to his friends in a way that she learned about only gradually, in the way one learns most wounding things, by accident, in pieces, never quite when you are prepared. The first piece came at a dinner party, hosted by Lord Prentice. Lenora had gone upstairs to retrieve a wrap she had forgotten, and she passed the smoking room with its door slightly open, and she heard Graham's voice, familiar and contained, saying, "She's a capable woman, efficient, but not exactly what you'd call lively company. I sometimes think she'd have made a better housekeeper than a wife." She stood very still in the corridor. The laughter that followed was the laughter of men who are mildly amused, and feel no need to examine why. She walked upstairs. She retrieved her wrap. She came back down and sat through 4 more courses with her back straight and her expression pleasant. And she spoke to Lady Prentice about the plans for the new school building, and she did not cry until she was home. The second piece came 6 months later. She had not meant to overhear that either. She had learned, after the first time, not to walk too close to rooms where Graham was entertaining. But the library had a particular acoustical quality that funneled sound through the south wall, and her sitting room was directly adjacent, and she had been reading, and she had heard him say, clearly and without any particular venom, to whoever was with him, "The problem with an arranged marriage is that you've agreed to something before you know what you've agreed to. I would have preferred a woman with a little more spirit. A little more spirit." Lenora set down her book. She thought about the hawk in the grass. She thought about her father writing that letter with his trembling hand, trying to give her something to hold on to. She thought about the 17 months she had spent every person on this estate by name, organizing every household expense into careful categories, writing letters of inquiry on behalf of tenants who could not read, quietly redirecting the cook's budget to prevent waste, personally ensuring that the grain store was restocked before the first frost, because she had noticed the inventory and no one else had. A little more spirit. She picked up her book again. She did not say anything to Graham. She did not change the way she managed the house, or the way she spoke to him at dinner, or the way she rose each morning and continued to do the invisible necessary work of keeping his life in order. But something shifted, in the deep and quiet way that tectonic things shift. Not dramatically, not with noise. She simply began, for the first time in 2 years of marriage, to think about leaving. She did not leave immediately. She was not impulsive by nature, and she understood that leaving required preparation. It required, first of all, somewhere to go. Her mother had remarried the previous spring, a widower named Mr. Cavendish Moore, who was perfectly pleasant and who lived in Edinburgh, and Lenora had no desire to arrive on that doorstep with a failed marriage and no explanation. Her father's sister, her Aunt Rosemary, lived in the south of France and wrote letters that were full of sunshine and self-absorption in equal measure. She had no real resources of her own. Her dowry had passed to Graham upon their marriage, as such things did. What she did have was skill. She had managed a house of 12 rooms for 2 years. She had overseen staff, budgets, correspondence, and community relations. She had quietly and without acknowledgement turned Whitmore Hall from a well-maintained but somewhat cold estate into a place that functioned with genuine care. She wrote a letter to a woman named Mrs. Alcott, the widow of a Yorkshire industrialist, whom she had met on the village school committee. Mrs. Alcott had spoken once of her difficulty in finding a capable secretary, someone who could manage correspondence and social obligations. She had been, Lenora suspected, speaking as much to herself as to anyone in particular. Lenora's letter was brief. She explained that she found herself in need of new occupation, that her administrative experience was considerable, and that she would welcome the opportunity to discuss the matter at Mrs. Alcott's convenience. She sent the letter on a Tuesday. She received a reply on Thursday. She visited Mrs. Alcott the following Monday, and by the end of the week she had accepted a position, modest salary, room and board included, beginning on the 1st of the following month. She told Graham on a Wednesday evening, after dinner, while he was reading by the fire. "I've accepted a position," she said, "as secretary to Mrs. Alcott in Harrowfield. I'll be leaving on the 15th. Graham looked up from his book. He looked at her for a moment, with an expression she could not entirely read. "You've accepted a position," he repeated. "Yes, you're my wife. I am aware of that." He set down his book. "What is this about, Lenora?" And she thought about all the things it was about: the smoking room at Lord Prentice's, the south wall of the library. Not exactly what you'd call lively company. A little more spirit. 2 years of invisible work, of learning every name, of rerouting the grain stores, of sitting across from him at dinner while he looked at her with that careful, courteous blankness, as though she were a piece of furniture he had ordered and had no strong feelings about. She thought about telling him all of this. "I find," she said, "that I need to be somewhere I am more useful." She had expected him to argue. She had expected anger, or at minimum the cold, precise displeasure he wielded when things did not go as he had arranged. Instead, he looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, very quietly, "I see." And she left on the 15th, with 2 trunks and a small wooden box, and her father's letter folded very precisely inside it. She was useful to Mrs. Alcott almost immediately. The woman's correspondence had been unmanaged for the better part of a year. There were invitations unanswered, accounts unsorted, a legal matter with her late husband's estate that had been sitting in a drawer, because Mrs. Alcott could not bring herself to address it, and her previous secretary had not known how. Lenora sorted it all within the first 2 weeks, calmly and methodically, and when Mrs. Alcott came into the study on a Friday morning and found the desk cleared and the files organized and a summary of the legal matter with 3 possible courses of action noted on a single sheet, she sat down in her chair and looked at Lenora with something approaching wonder. "Where did you come from?" she said. "Whitmore Hall," Lenora said. "And why did you leave?" Lenora considered the question. "I found that my skills were not being used." Mrs. Alcott accepted this. She was a woman who had spent 30 years married to a man who valued efficiency above all things, and she understood that the question of whether a skill was being used was a serious one. What Lenora had not anticipated was how much she would enjoy it. Not merely the work, she had always found the work satisfying, but the being seen doing it. Mrs. Alcott thanked her. Specifically, with words that referred to particular things she had done. She introduced Lenora to her friends as my secretary, Mrs. Whitmore, who has put my affairs entirely in order. She consulted her. She asked for her opinion on things and then listened to the answer. Lenora had not realized, until it began happening, how long it had been since anyone had listened to her. She wrote to Graham every 2 weeks. Correct, informative letters, the kind that could not be read as either olive branch or accusation. She noted that she hoped the estate accounts were in order, that Mrs. Pruitt would require assistance finding a new kitchen maid in November, that the Southfield fence had been repaired, but the northwest corner still needed attention. She did not ask how he was. He replied with letters that were equally correct and slightly shorter. The first time she saw him again was 4 months after she had left. She was in Harrowfield, leaving the solicitor's office, after finalizing some business for Mrs. Alcott, when she turned a corner, and there he was, coming out of the bank. He was alone, he looked. She had not expected this. Tired. Not the ordinary tiredness of a man who had slept poorly. Something else, the kind of tired that lives behind the eyes. He saw her at approximately the same moment. They both stopped. "Lenora," he said. "Graham," she said. They stood on the pavement for a moment in the way of 2 people who have run out of scripts. "How is Mrs. Alcott?" he said. "Very well. How is the estate?" "Adequately managed." He paused. "I hired a new housekeeper. Mrs. Pruitt has retired. I know, she wrote to me." Something moved across his face at that, too quickly to name. "She wrote to you. She has for years. I did not realize you were unaware of that." He was quiet for a moment. A cart passed in the street. Someone called a greeting to someone else further down the road. "The northwest fence," he said, "was more significant than you indicated. It needed replacing entirely. I thought it might be." I mentioned it twice to the groundskeeper, but I was not certain it had been addressed. It hadn't been. I'll make a note to be more direct in future correspondence. He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted, tightened in the way of a man who is about to say something and is not certain he knows how. Lenora. I should get back, she said. I have letters to finish before 4. She left him standing on the pavement. She walked 3 blocks before she allowed herself to feel the particular, complicated weight of having seen him, and having not fallen apart, and having also noticed, with the precision of someone who cannot quite help noticing, that he had looked at her, in that final moment, the way her father had once described. Like a man surprised by something. The thing that changed everything happened in March, 6 months after she had left. There was a dinner given by the new Lord Ashfield. Young Ashfield, who had inherited the title from his uncle, and was eager to establish himself. And it was the kind of dinner that everyone in the county attended, because not attending was itself a statement. Lenora went with Mrs. Alcott. Graham was there, as the Whitmore family had always maintained a connection with the Ashfields. She had not known he would be there, or rather, she had known it was possible, and had not quite prepared for the reality of him across a room in his evening clothes, which he wore the way he wore everything, precisely, and without apparent effort. She had also not known that there would be a man at the dinner named Mr. Orrin Calloway. Not her list. Wait, Calloway was on the list. She checked. Yes, she had to choose differently. There was a man at the dinner named Mr. Orrin Barfield, a solicitor from Leeds who was visiting Lord Ashfield on business, and had been included as a courtesy. He was pleasant and well-read, and he found Lenora's opinions on the management of rural estates genuinely interesting, or at least he gave every impression of doing so, and he made her laugh twice during the first course. Genuine laughter, unguarded. The kind she had not produced in company in longer than she wished to calculate. She did not notice Graham at that moment, but he noticed her. She learned this only later, from Mrs. Alcott, who had been seated close enough to observe, and who told Lenora with the particular relish of someone who had been waiting for an opportunity. Your husband watched you for a full 10 minutes while you were talking to that solicitor from Leeds. He looked, if I am being honest, as though someone had explained something to him that he should have understood a long time ago. Lenora did not respond to this immediately. He asked me about you, Mrs. Alcott continued. After dinner, he asked if you were happy. What did you tell him? Mrs. Alcott considered. I told him that you were useful, and that you were appreciated, and that both of those things appeared to agree with you considerably. She paused. He did not look well when I said it. Graham came to see her the following week. He arrived at Mrs. Alcott's house on a Thursday morning, which was the kind of thing a man did when he had thought about it enough that the thinking itself had become intolerable. He was shown into the small sitting room where Lenora received visitors, and when she came in he was standing at the window looking at the garden with his hands behind his back, which was a posture she recognized as the posture of a man who was preparing to say something he had rehearsed, and was afraid had come out wrong in rehearsal. He turned when she came in. I owe you an apology, he said, before she had even sat down. Several, in fact, but I've started with the most significant one, and I intend to work my way through the others, so I'd ask you to let me finish before you say anything. She sat down. She folded her hands in her lap. I called you a burden, he said, to Prentice, or I implied it, which is the same thing. I told him you had not been what I expected, meaning I had expected to feel nothing about this marriage, and you had made that difficult by being. He stopped. By being a person, which I had apparently not entirely anticipated. Lenora said nothing. I said you lacked spirit, which was not only untrue, but was precisely backward, because the truth is that you frightened me a little. You managed everything so quietly and so well that I did not know what to do with you. I am not, he said, and his voice was very controlled, but she could hear something underneath it. A man who knows what to do with things he cannot manage, and I could not manage you. I could not predict you or categorize you, or understand what you wanted from me, and so I told myself that you wanted nothing, and that was the simpler arrangement. He paused. Mrs. Pruitt, he said, retired in November. Before she left, she gave me a list. It was 3 pages long. It was every task you had performed in the 2 years of our marriage that she was aware of, along with the outcomes. It took me some time to read it. It took me longer to understand it. Not the tasks themselves. I understood the tasks. What I did not understand, until I read that list, was that you had done all of it without being asked, without being thanked, without, as far as I can determine, ever asking for either acknowledgement or assistance. He looked at her steadily. I want to understand why you did not simply tell me, because, Lenora said, I tried to tell you in the ways I knew how. I kept the house, and the accounts and the tenants, and the correspondence, and I sat across from you at dinner every night, and I was present, and I was. She stopped. I was there. And you did not look. The silence that followed this was the first real silence they had ever shared. Not the comfortable silence of people who do not need to speak, and not the uncomfortable silence of people who are avoiding something. Something else. The silence of two people who have finally arrived at the actual conversation. No, Graham said. I did not look. He sat down then, across from her, in the same configuration they had held every evening for 2 years, and it was different. I am asking you, he said, to come home. Not because the estate needs managing, though it does. Not because Mrs. Pruitt's replacement is adequate but not exceptional, though she isn't, because... He paused. Something in his expression was doing the particular work of a man who has rehearsed a thing and has now reached the part he did not rehearse. Because I rode past the East Meadow last week, and I thought about telling you that the old oak had come down in the storm, and then I remembered that you weren't there to tell, and I sat on my horse in the middle of the field for longer than I'm comfortable admitting. Lenora looked at him. She thought about her father's letter. He looked at you the way a man looks at something that surprises him. I'm not going to tell you yes today, she said. Something moved through him. Not disappointment exactly, more like the resignation of a man who had expected this and understands it is fair. All right, he said. I have responsibilities here that I won't simply abandon. Mrs. Alcott has trusted me with a number of ongoing matters that need resolution on. All right. And I want, she said, and she chose her next words very carefully, to be spoken of differently, not privately, which you cannot entirely control, but in general. I want to be introduced as your wife, in a way that means something, and I want the tenants' families to know that the work they receive comes from both of us, and I want. She stopped. I want you to look at me. He held her gaze. I'm looking at you now. I know, she said. I know you are. She went back to Whitmore Hall in May, not immediately, and not without conditions, and not in the way she had arrived the first time, uncertain and obedient and willing to make herself smaller than she was. She went back in the spring, with her wooden box and her father's letter and 2 months more experience at Mrs. Alcott's, and she stood in the entrance hall of the house, that had never quite felt like hers, and she looked around at it differently. Graham was waiting. He had clearly been waiting for some time. He did not say anything elaborate. He said, "Welcome back," and it came out slightly rough around the edges, the way his voice went when he was feeling something he had not yet learned to carry smoothly. "Thank you," she said. He had put flowers in her sitting room. She noticed them when she went upstairs. Not an extravagant arrangement. He was not an extravagant man. But they were the particular deep gold flowers she had mentioned once, many months ago, admiring in the village market. She had not expected him to remember. She was not entirely sure he had been paying attention when she said it. He had been paying attention. There was a gathering in June, a midsummer evening, that Lord Ashfield hosted on the grounds of his estate. The kind of event that the whole county came to, because it was warm, and the grounds were beautiful, and there was always the expectation that something memorable would happen. Something memorable happened. Graham made a speech. He was not, as a rule, a man who made speeches. He was a man who preferred to communicate in writing, or one-on-one conversation where he could control the precision of his language. And so when he rose at the dinner table, and asked for the room's attention, there was a slight pause, the collective attention of 50 people sharpening. He spoke about the Whitmore estate. He spoke about the tenants, and the land, and the way that a place either serves its people, or diminishes them, and how he had come to understand, in the past 2 years, that the difference between those two outcomes was often invisible to the people who hadn't made it happen. Then he said Lenora's name, clearly, in a room of 50 people, with 50 people listening. He said that for 2 years of their marriage, his wife had done the work that he had been too blind to see, that she had known the names of every child on their land, and every family who needed assistance before they knew to ask for it, that she had managed their household with a skill and a care that he had failed entirely to acknowledge, and that he owed her the public acknowledgement of it because some debts were too significant to settle privately. She is, he said, the best thing that has ever been arranged in my life, and I intend to spend considerably longer understanding what that means than I spent ignoring it. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Mrs. Alcott, seated 3 places down, began to clap. And the room followed. Lenora sat very still. Her hands were folded on the table. Her back was very straight. She realized distantly, trying very hard not to cry, not because she was unhappy, but because she was not, and she had not felt that particular problem in some time. Graham sat back down beside her. He looked at her, the way he was learning to look at her, with the surprised attention of a man who had spent too long not looking, and was still adjusting to how much there was to see. "Too much?" he said quietly. "No," she said. She reached under the table and found his hand, which was very still, waiting, in the way that his hands went when he was trying not to betray himself. "Not too much at all," she said. Outside, the June evening was warm and gold, the kind of evening that forgives everything, the kind that makes you understand why people stay in places and tend them and call them home. The music had started again in the garden, drifting through the long windows, and Lenora Whitmore sat in a room full of people who now knew her name, and she held her husband's hand, and she thought about a girl of 17 kneeling in the grass to watch a hawk, and how long it had taken the right person to look.